I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1720 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly and Dr. Bob Rodrigues, that renowned history professor from Duquesne University up there in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, sitting right there on the banks of the mighty Monongahela River. This episode will be the first of two where Dr. Rodrigues will talk about the counterculture that went on during the Vietnam War. While we were over there in Southeast Asia, there were some crazy things going on back here in the States. He's going to describe it from start to finish and all points in between, telling us about what was happening back then. The American culture was going through some big changes during those years. The Vietnam War was sort of a catalyst to help kick off many of these changes. Dr. Rodrigues is going to explain each of those very carefully, and I think you're going to find it very interesting. Before he gets started, I'd like you to remember one thing, and it's very important. Get rid of all your distractions so you can devote 100% of your attention to what he's going to tell you, because it's that important. I even encourage you to have pen and paper nearby to make some notes. I started doing that because he puts out so much information that I would like to remember, because most Vietnam veterans have some sort of connection with just about everything he's going to say. So with that in mind, Dr. Bob, it's all yours. You've got the mic. Go for it.
Hi, Mac. Great to be back again. We left off last time with the Tet Offensive, the turning point of the Vietnam War. Today we're going to spend some time on the counterculture. Now, I mentioned last time that the Tet Offensive was a military victory for the United States in the sense that they almost broke the backs of the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were not real significant in the war after that. I mean, they still were around, but much of the fighting now went to the NVA. But politically, the United States was defeated, because when news got back home and you heard the Cronkite and a lot of the other videos and just film footage that were shown on TV were so powerful that the American people began to really question the war. Even Lyndon Johnson, at one point, when he heard what Cronkite said, he says, "Oh my God, I've even lost Walter Cronkite. I've lost Middle America." He realized the significance of it as well. So what this is going to do is give some steam to the protest movement and what we call the counterculture movement. The counterculture movement is essentially a rejection of cultural standards by young people with parents and other adults with regard to racial segregation, the Vietnam War, sexual mores, and women's rights and materialism. And they use the symbol, the peace symbol, which really started in the 50s as a nuclear disarmament symbol, but then it was adopted in the anti-Vietnam, the protest movements, anti-Vietnam. The hippies were regarded as perhaps the largest class of the counterculture, and they were mostly members of the white middle class without political drive. Okay, and what they were characterized by were jeans, tie-dye shirts, sandals, beards, long hair, promiscuity, and recreational drugs. The hippie movement actually had its roots in the Beat generation of the 1950s. The Beat generation was young people in the 50s who simply rejected conventional society. And they practiced Zen Buddhism. They favored modern jazz, free sexuality, and recreational drugs. A couple authors that were highly connected with the Beat generation were Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, two prominent authors. Now, San Francisco became the base city of the hippie movement in the 1960s, along with Greenwich Village and Berkeley. Berkeley, California, were also strong bases. The Vietnam War was the catalyst for their social protests, their social disagreements. The hippies, their peak was in the 1967 in the so-called Summer of Love. The origination point, the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco. Haight-Ashbury is just an intersection. It's an intersection in San Francisco where a lot of this began and then disseminated, from there. The counterculture integrated ideas and indulgences of the time. And some of they believed in peace, love, harmony, music, and mysticism. The counterculture was also a movement that was marked by the growing distrust of government. And this is going to coincide with the Vietnam War, and that is why the counterculture is also associated with the protest movement, Vietnam, on civil rights, women's rights, and the key issues of the time. There were other counterculture groups that, besides the hippies. What emerged in the early 60s was a group called the New Left. And they were basically middle-class college students. And one of the founding organizations were the Students for a Democratic Society, often referred to simply as SDS. They actually originated from the University of Michigan in 1960. They issued something called the Port Huron Statement, which criticized lack of individual freedom and bureaucratic institutions. Tom Hayden and 58 others authored this Port Huron Statement, and it actually brought the term, and this is in quotes, participatory democracy into the common parlance. Participatory democracy. They also promoted nonviolent civil disobedience, which is going to be one of the inspirations of Dr. Martin Luther King. Other counterculture movements in the University of California at Berkeley, 1964, there was something called the Free Speech Movement. They used tactics like sit-ins and takeovers of college buildings. Their leader was a Mario Savio, Savio. They wanted academic freedom, and they also wanted a ban on political action or political activities to be lifted. And they became a buzz of protest there out in Berkeley, California. The SDS in 1965 organized a nationwide campaign against the draft. So this is at the early stages when the draft was just really being put into operation or in full use. Other counterculture groups, there was a group called the Weathermen. Now, the Weathermen were a splinter group from the SDS. They splintered off of the SDS, and they were a little bit more violent. They actually launched a bombing campaign in the 1970s, and they targeted government buildings and banks, and they oftentimes wore helmets. They were called the Weathermen. Other counterculture groups, well, at the Chicago Convention, we mentioned that briefly last time. The Chicago Convention was the Democratic convention to nominate a presidential candidate for the 1968 election. And it was marked by anti-war protests because the Democratic Party was associated with the war since Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy. And a group emerged there called the Yippies. They were the Youth International Party. And there was another group entitled the National Mobilization Against the War in Vietnam organization. So there were numerous counterculture groups that came into play. And again, going back, the hippies are the ones that almost are the face of it, but there were many more. In regard to women's rights, there was sexual politics. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique and really kind of ignited the women's rights movement. There were riots in the Stonewall Inn in New York. This is for LGBTQ rights and became a symbol of their battle against the establishment. The counterculture rejected mainstream culture, as we have said, and they were probably best embodied in the different genres of music that were coming forth, such as the psychedelic rock music, pop art, and explorations in spirituality. Some of the musicians who exemplified that era were the most recognizable: the Beatles, the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, Rolling Stones, Neil Young, Bob Dylan, and Janis Joplin. They are really, that's an all-star crew of the counterculture. Their lyrics and popular sayings, which expressed their sentiments, were things like this. They would say, quote, "Do your own thing," quote, "Turn on, tune in, drop out," end quote. Quote, "Whatever turns you on," end quote. Quote, 8 miles high, end quote. Quote, "Sex, drugs, and rock and roll," end quote. Quote, "Light my fire," end quote. And essentially, it was known as the Age of Aquarius.
That was part one of Dr. Bob's presentation about the counterculture. All that stuff that was going on back here in the States while we were overseas, over in Southeast Asia. I don't know about you, but I found it very interesting to hear him enumerate all the groups and their programs that were going on during the counterculture. In the next episode, he's going to talk about a pivotal point in our history, and that is Woodstock. When he tells you everything that's involved with it and all the ramifications that came with it, I think you'll agree. It brought cultural changes to our country that are still with us today. Now, make sure you do not miss the next episode where he's going to talk about Woodstock and give you a complete description of it from start to finish and all points in between. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1720 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for listening to these stories. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?